Here is our final animation playing in the Photoshop timeline and in a web browser. We have been learning frame-based sequential animation using the frame timeline in Adobe Photoshop. Now we're going to begin to explore keyframe-based animation using the video timeline in Photoshop. But first, we can take our frame animation, which we were exporting as a GIF file, we can also export as a video. I'm just going to go with the default settings here and then go ahead and click Render. I'll replace. Let's go ahead and take a look. Here's our video. So I'm going to open the video. Let's loop, and we're going to play our video. Now, video is going to use more frames per second. What's going to happen is the files are going to be larger and there's the potential for a lag time. And we certainly see that there is a lag time in the gears now, and this has to do with how many frames were created when the video was made. So let's just go ahead and open this same video in a web browser, and we will also loop, and let's play. And if you watch the gears, you're going to see what is a momentary hesitation. And we didn't have that hesitation in the frame animation, but now that we have converted to a video, things have changed. To get started, I'm going to point out that we could take the easy way out. And I'm going to show you what I'm talking about is we're just going to select the option right down here in the lower left corner, and we're going to convert our frame timeline animation to a Photoshop video timeline animation. And I just want to play this video. I should say play the timeline. Now everything looks okay here, but trust me, the lag is still here in the gears. This is the easy way of taking your frame-based animation and creating a video timeline animation. But we can do better. When we converted from a frame timeline to a keyframe timeline, you will see that our layers are now stacked up. And if I just open this layer, you will see that instead of individual frames, we have keyframes. And the idea is we make changes frame to frame to frame. And then the computer creates the interim frames or the in-betweens, often called tweening in animation. Now, it was really easy converting to our keyframe timeline. However, our original animation was only 12 frames. And we are set at 30 frames per second. So let me go ahead and close, and let's open our options panel here. And we will scroll down, and you might want to explore this panel. There's lots of cool things in here, like onion skinning, which we discussed in the frame animation. Let's go down to our frame rate. And what I'm getting at here is our current animation is 12 frames. And our animation timeline frame rate is 30 frames per second, which means we have about a little more than 1/3 of a second of animation. If we go back and play, you'll see just how quickly that playhead is moving. Our animation, we only have about 1/3 of a second of animation. So let me stop. And the point I'm making is this is not nearly as flexible if you now need to go in and start making some changes. And I'm also going to point out that because we were using basically visibility as a means to create animation, something being on or off in certain steps in a frame-based animation, here the keyframes are now being treated as individual states. And our keyframes, what happens between or the type of change from keyframe to keyframe is called interpolation. And right now our interpolation is set to hold. So you will see from basically 0 frame to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, they're individual steps. This is going to make modifying your animation much more difficult. Let me provide an example here. Let's go with this frame right here, and let's bring our panel down so we can see the area for blast off a little better. I'm going to keep this frame. I'm just going to hover over and select and then delete, and I can do this with the right click also. We can delete. I'm going to delete these frames. I'll take this frame and now move it down. And if we go back, we have a hold interpolation. If we play, you'll see that blink, that flash. That's because from our first frame, we're holding, and now we have the change. We can change our frame interpolation. So I'll just select both the frames, right click, and we will go or switch from hold to linear interpolation. So now you'll see instead of that little square, we have a diamond. And this diamond is our keyframe. And you'll now see that there is a subtle change. You will see that there is a subtle change as we progress through the frames. There's an important concept, frame interpolation. Are you going to hold a frame? Are you going to allow the computer to tween the changes? Doing a simple conversion, switching your frame-based animation to a keyframe-based animation is easy. It's a click of a button. But what you end up with is an animation that is limited. You're stuck with X amount of frames. The program has figured out to use interpolation, and you just have a lot going on inside your timeline. So you're really better off starting with a fresh animation. And that's what we're going to do. The idea is to start fresh, but let's be smart about how we go about this. I'm going to begin by selecting the burnt orange layer, my background layer, and I'm just going to copy this. And the idea is when we make a new Photoshop document, the document will be based on the clipboard, otherwise what we just copied. All of our preset details should be just fine. So let's create, and then we can go ahead and paste. If we want to really be careful, we could do paste special, paste in place, and we now have our burnt orange background. I'm going to take the original background and toss it, and then we will go ahead and create a video timeline. If this is not available to you, then go up to the window menu and go down to timeline, and then select the video timeline. We now have our start point for our new banner. So basically, I'm going to just continue bringing assets into this file. I have now completed copy pasting all of the files that I need from the converted frame animation into our new timeline animation. And you may ask yourself, why did he do it that way instead of just doing a save as? Here's why. Because I didn't want to go in and get rid of all of these different keyframes, and I didn't want to work with all of these layers in these groups, and it was actually faster just to select the files I needed, and you can select multiple layers, go to your new document, and edit, paste special, paste in place, and everything will go as exactly as the original. I'm going to point out that the default, and we can zoom in and zoom out of our timeline with this little slider down here. And the default in the preferences for our timeline is 5 seconds. And typically your animations, your timeline animations are 30 frames per second. You will also note that the default length of each of the assets brought in is roughly about 12 or 1.2 seconds. So you need to extend all of the durations. Now this is again assuming that you want the content to show up the entire span of the playhead. You may in fact want elements to go away. So you could change the length or the duration of your asset accordingly. And just to toss out, when we are at 0 and we enter the frame, enter the timeline, this would be the birth of the asset. The time that the asset is visible is the life of the asset, and when that asset is no longer visible, that is considered the death of the asset. I'm not making this stuff up. That is standard professional terminology for animation. Now, I'm going to pause and then go ahead and extend all the durations. After reflecting on the frame-based animation, I'm going to do a few things differently in the keyframe animation. But before I get started, I want to first go in and open up and look at the transformers for a couple of the assets because they brought keyframes in with them. What we can do is just this little stopwatch for style here. So I see I have keyframes for style. If I click the stopwatch, that will erase all of the keyframes. If I click again, this now enables the addition of keyframes. So I'm going to click this off. I believe there are also some keyframes on gear 2. So we'll click opacity and remove the keyframes. We'll go to gear 1 and we will do the same thing. We will remove the keyframes. I believe those were the only keyframes we needed to deal with. Next, I'm going to go to layers and I'm just going to hide the assets that I don't need to work with right now. So I only want to work with gear 1 and my background. So I should be ready to start the animation process for the gear. Now we are going to animate the gear. But what we need to think about is the total duration of our animation and then the animated components inside. And one of the more complex components will be the gear. And we need to have the gear turn 360 degrees. So I want to be able to turn my gear 360 degrees in X amount of time to get the correct speed. So what we need to do is figure out the rotation and the speed of the gear in relationship to the total duration of the animation. Our animation is going to be 5 seconds long. The gear is going to animate in 90-degree increments every second. So we need 4 changes of 90 degrees to get a total of 360 degrees. And that's easiest to do in 4 seconds. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's look at the transformers for gear 1. We have position, opacity, and style. There's nothing there about rotation, and we don't want to go down the route of changing opacity and multiple layers of gears. There's another way to do it. This is how. First, with the gear selected, let's go to our layers. I'm going to find gear 1. There it is, just to make sure. Let's go to our options, and we are going to convert to a smart object. Now that this gear is a smart object, when we look at the transformers, we see transform is available. And this is very important because now we can transform multiple properties of the gear. Playhead at 0 in time, we will enable transform. So we now have keyframes beginning for transform. We're going to go to 1 second in time, and we will add an additional keyframe. Now let's go ahead and rotate clockwise our gear 90 degrees, and then we will set. We will advance to 2 seconds, add a keyframe, and rotate an additional 90 degrees and set. We'll go to 3 seconds, add a keyframe. Again, rotate 90 degrees and set. Then we will go to 4 seconds, add our last keyframe, and go an additional 90 degrees. We should be back at 0 degrees, and we will set. I'm going to move the workspace down to match 4 seconds. We'll just make sure we are setting loop playback, and then we will play. And we now have our gear animating 360 degrees clockwise. Let's revisit keyframe interpolation very quickly here. So we'll play, and we will see linear interpolation, where the keyframes are being tweened by the application. Let's right-click the selected keyframes and select Hold Interpolation. Now the diamonds change to squares, and when we play, you're going to see that nothing really appears to happen. You can see the gear move because the gear is not perfectly round. So we might have to fix this later. But what you are seeing is that each change in rotation is being held. Let's stop, right-click, go back to linear interpolation, play, and our animation returns. Total duration for the animation is 5 seconds. The gear is rotating in 4 seconds, so that's not ideal. That's going to actually create some issues. So we have to make a decision, and that's going to be with the speed. And if we shorten up the duration of our animation, then with the gear, then the increments of change in the rotation are going to make the animation faster. If we lengthen the duration, then the animation will be slower. Let's take a look. First, we will zoom in a little bit. If our total duration is 5 seconds, then we would need to go to 2 seconds, 15 frames, right there. Now I'll zoom out a little bit. And what I'm going to do with all of the keyframes selected, I'm going to hold the Option key on a Mac, Alt on a PC, and then I'll click on the last keyframe, and I'll drag all the keyframes at the same time. And we're going to redistribute time and movement. All right, let's go ahead and shorten our workspace to that new time, and we will play. And you will see the gear speed change. Let's go ahead and stop. We'll go back to 0 in time just to be on the safe side. I will extend the duration to 5 seconds. We will hold Option or Alt, depending on Mac or PC, and click on the last keyframe, and we will drag out. And I will drag out this keyframe all the way to the very end. And again, let's play, and you will see your animation go slower. And this is because of the relationship of space and time. The amount of time available and the space for which the element is moving or changing. Once animated, moving the gear is a bit of a pain. Here's what I mean. Let's go ahead and note all of the keyframes are selected. Let's move our gear to the other side of the banner and then play. And you'll see that the gear moves from the position we moved it to back to where it was, which is kind of cool, but let me go ahead and stop. If you wanted the gear to remain in one place and rotate, then it's more difficult. Let me undo. So what you need to do is select each keyframe one at a time, and then go to your properties, and then just note the X and the Y coordinate. So you will move your gear or your animated element, note the X and the Y, then go to the next keyframe, and the best way to get exactly on the keyframe is to click on the little triangles on either side of the diamond, and we'll go exactly to our keyframe. And then you will change the X and the Y coordinates. And you will continue to do this for each of the keyframes. It's a pain, but it's what you have to do. As example, I moved the gear to the other side of the banner, and then one at a time selected the keyframe, and then changed the coordinate for the gear. I only had to change the X, but you'll now see each gear is in the same position. So when we play, our animation is again a perfect rotation. It's just now the gear has been moved. Changing position for all the keyframes is a bit of a pain, but the positive is you can now do animation like this. I'll select the first keyframe at 0, 0 in time, I'm going to move the gear to be about approximately halfway off of the banner. We will go to our next keyframe. I'll select the keyframe. And now I'm just going to guess at the interim positions. We're ultimately trying to get the gear to go to the other side. So let's just say here, and then we'll go to our next keyframe. And you'll get the idea. I would probably take my time and do a much better, much more thorough job of this. Let's get that keyframe at 3 seconds in time. And let's go here. And then we'll get our last keyframe. I'm going to have to move this one over. And let's go halfway off the banner-ish. And now we get this animation. Okay, so if you're much more careful and you plan out your interim positions, now you'll have the gear spinning and moving across the screen. And because we had the gear start halfway on the screen and halfway off the screen, the end result is a continuous loop of entering the screen, going across the screen, then leaving the screen, and again entering the screen. To get a perfectly smooth animation, I took the width of the banner, 1080, divided by 4, and ended up with a unit of 270. So I placed a guide at 270, a guide at 540, and a guide at 810. And then I moved the gear to correspond with its center at each of those positions. And the end result is a nice, smooth, linear animation of our gear moving across the banner and also rotating. Let's experiment. We're going to create an animation that starts off slow and then accelerates to a higher speed. So we're going to deal with space and time, spatial and temporal. So to go slow, we need more space and time. And to go fast, we need less space and time. So I'm going to move the keyframes. And this is the beauty of keyframe animation, is it's easy to move your keyframes and then experiment. Or you can do the math and figure it out exactly, but let's just experiment. So we're going to have more space and time and then less space and time, and we should get an effect like this. Okay, we can exacerbate that a little bit. Unfortunately, the gear's going to go really slow, but let's do something like this and then test. So really slow, we're going to speed up some more, and some more. So an example of creating acceleration by adjusting the space and the time between your keyframes. In this example, I added additional interim frames and then spaced out, I should say interim keyframes, and then spaced those keyframes to where we had more space and time at the beginning. And then the idea is to almost half the amount of time, half again, half, 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 and we end up with an animation that looks like this. So we start out slow, and we progressively speed up until we get to the end. Let's reposition our keyframes one more time. This time, we will have less space initially. We'll allow that space between keyframes to grow, and then basically hold consistent, and then diminish, diminish, diminish. Let's see what we get. All right, so I encourage you to experiment with working with acceleration, deceleration, and even constant linear velocity. Here's another cool trick for working with your gear animation, or any animation. We're going to make a video out of the keyframe animation, and here's how. I'm going to select this small gear. It's called Gear 2. We'll copy this, and we'll go to a new Photoshop file. We'll paste this in, and on the timeline, I have created our keyframes, only this time I have the gear rotating anti-clockwise, or counterclockwise. And we are, again, going 90 degrees per keyframe until we get to the very last keyframe, at which point, instead of 90 degrees, we go 87, 3 degrees less, just like we did with the other gear animations. All right, so we have our animation set up. What we'll do now is just go up to File, Export, and we will render our video. We'll go with the name I provided, Solo Gear MP4. All the default settings should be fine, so we will click Render. We'll go back to our Photoshop document and let's take our gear, drag our gear in, scale down a little bit. Now that this is a movie, it's super easy to move around. So let's go ahead and commit to that. We'll go to layers, find my gear. Here it is here. We'll go to our screen modes. Let's go with lighten, and then we'll go back to 0 in time. And I might have had the playhead. Yep, I had it moved down. So let's just move our duration back. Let's play our animation. And we now have our smaller gear rotating counterclockwise. Now, it's interesting. There's a little jump. And I have a feeling that this is a performance thing with Photoshop. Now that it's calculating these different moves, it's just choking when we're jumping back to the beginning keyframe. But just to test, let's go ahead and stop. We'll go File, Export, and render the video. Let's just call this Test and render. I'll replace the one I had. We'll get a browser window. We'll take our test file, drag it in, set loop, and we'll watch this for a moment. And hopefully now what we will see is a pretty smooth rotation of our gears. I have finished up the animation using concepts which I go over in other videos that have been provided to you for learning timeline animation in Photoshop. But I do want to point a couple of things out that have to do with organization. So as an example, we can see that there are a lot of assets and a lot of copies of assets. So the better you can organize your work into layers within folders, the easier it will be for you to work. I'm suggesting that you create folders, you place content within the folders. This way, it's easy to collapse all the folders. And when the folders are collapsed, what we see in the timeline isn't so visually busy. The original duration of the animation was 5 seconds, and you'll now note that the animation is 10 seconds long. And because we worked in a modular way with our animations, it was really easy to extend the duration to 10 seconds, and then simply take one folder of assets, like gear stuff, make a copy. So I have gear stuff copy. So here's gear stuff copy. And then you will notice that all I did was change the duration by sliding the duration for the copy down. So we now have an animation that runs for 10 seconds. To get an effect like this countdown is easy. All we need to do is create the individual assets, and then I'm storing them all in a folder for good organization. Then we can simply create what appears like a stair step. So we only have each asset with a duration of X amount of time, one after the next, after the next. And this is a really easy way to create an effect like a countdown. For the blast off effect, we're going to use a series of transformers. We will combine both hold position or hold frames as well as linear frames. And you'll see that we are transforming opacity, and we're also transforming text warp or warp text in the menu. And we're simply using one of the different warps and then animating the warp. So we're changing opacity, we're changing position, and we are warping the text. For the rocket flame, you'll see that we have a short animation. We're using hold frames, and we're simply just moving the position of the flame. Then a copy is made of the original 2-second duration. And then again, we use copy method of taking our short duration, making a copy, and then using the step duration approach. I'll go ahead and extend the step duration approach. So the same animation is played over and over. It's just the 2 seconds is now multiplied by 5 animation groups. And the same thing is done for flame 1. So the end result is our rocket flame jittering or moving over the entire 10 seconds. And here is an example of what our final animation will look like. Let's go ahead and render our final animation. So we will export, render our video. I'll change the name slightly, and render. And here is an example of what our final animation will look like.